Everybody, welcome to the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. I'm Jonathan Brown. I'm the Associate Director of this center and Professor in School of Foreign Service. Today we have a very valuable opportunity to hear from two voices who are not only experienced and deeply informed on issues of Iran, but also on U.S. policy in the Middle East overall. They are married, so it's not just coincidence that they have the same last name. Flynt and Hillary Leverett both teach international relations. Flynt at Penn State, Hillary at American University. And they also both served in the White House during the Bush administration. And Clinton administration. Oh, for her, Clinton, and Flynt was in the CIA. It's written down here. So and they, let's just say that since being in the Bush White House, they went on an intellectual journey, and the latest station in that journey is their book, Going to Tehran: Why the United States Must Come to Terms with the Islamic Republic, which was published in the spring of 2013, right? January, so last winter. And so they'll be speaking to us about that, and they just recently returned from Iran a couple of days ago, so with updates.
Yes.
So they'll speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Oh, and I'm supposed to tell you as well, by actually being here in this room, you're accepting that you're going to get recorded if you ask questions and things like that. It's one of these, walking in the door, signs a contract thing. It's Georgetown University policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you to the center for hosting us. To Mona, I don't see her right now, but thank you for all of the arrangements. And thank you, everyone, for coming out, especially on a rainy day in Washington. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. With the renewed talks, nuclear negotiations set to resume next week in Geneva, we thought it would be particularly important to really focus today on what's at stake in the U.S.-Iranian disagreement over Iran's nuclear activities and the diplomatic efforts to resolve those disagreements. In the wake of the new Iranian President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif's extensive public diplomacy in New York, American policy elites, including Obama administration officials, have been talking extensively about diplomacy with Iran, but really focused on what kind of concessions can be extracted from Iran in a renewed diplomatic process. It's our view that this focus is a mistake, because if productive diplomacy between the United States and Iran is to be possible, much more change needs to occur, needs to happen here in Washington than in fact it needs to happen in Tehran. For productive diplomacy will require the United States to accept, or as our book, in the title of our book, subtitle of our book terms it, to come to terms with the Islamic Republic as an enduring political entity representing legitimate national interests. We argue that Washington should do this not as a favor to the Islamic Republic of Iran, but because it's what's in our own interests, manifestly required in our own interests, and we think for two basic reasons. The first is that the United States, in our view, and I think it's supported by ever-increasing amounts of data, the United States is today a declining power in the Middle East. Not for, as some would say here in Washington, because of President Obama's vacillation or weakness, but that America's position in the Middle East is declining today and has been for the past several years because President Obama has essentially continued the same sorts of counterproductively hegemonic policies to the Middle East that both his Republican and Democratic predecessors have championed since the end of the Cold War. In our book, Going to Tehran, we describe this as the imperial turn in America's post-Cold War approach to the Middle East. And the core policies comprising this imperial turn include, right after the first Gulf War, the open-ended retention of U.S. military forces on the ground in Saudi Arabia and other GCC states, the crippling sanctions imposed on Saddam Hussein's Iraq that killed over 1 million Iraqis, half of them children, the invasions and prolonged occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, and principally for Obama now we're seeing his military intervention in Libya. These policies have proven not just quixotic, but deeply damaging to American interests. They're textbook examples of what the Yale scholar Paul Kennedy describes as imperial overreach. America's failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, now Libya, have squandered human and material resources, while maybe even more importantly, underscoring for the world, especially for Middle Eastern publics, the limits of what American military might can accomplish. Indeed, the self-inflicted debacle of the Obama administration's plan for military force against the Syrian government suggests that not only is the U.S. capacity to use force effectively for hegemonic purposes in the Middle East now in serious doubt, but the United States may no longer even have a credible threat to use force for such purposes. That's a significant change. Just as significant, the imperial thrust of American policy has decimated the perceived legitimacy of American purposes for the vast majority of populations throughout the Middle East. In this context, America's inability to come to terms with the Islamic Republic also reflects a broader and maybe deeper inability to come to terms with participatory Islamist governance in the Middle East. And it is our argument that that is and will continue to accelerate the erosion of American standing there. On the other side of the divide, of the US-Iranian divide, the Islamic Republic has developed what we would call a counter-hegemonic national security strategy that has enabled it not only to survive, but to carve out enough strategic autonomy to attain a high degree of domestic political consolidation and achieve a wide range of impressive developmental outcomes. In the process, the Islamic Republic has also positioned itself to take advantage of American mistakes to improve its own standing in the Middle East's balance of power. The resulting shift in the Middle East's regional balance is simultaneously distributional, affecting who has relative power, and essential, about the very basis of power. In effect, the Middle East regional balance is becoming less a balance of power defined by hard power capabilities, in which the United States has long had unique advantages, and more a balance of influence defined by soft power capabilities, in which the United States is profoundly disadvantaged. As the United States and Iran prepare for resumed nuclear negotiations next week, with, contrary to the conventional wisdom here in Washington, Iran entering those talks in a position of relative strength, and the United States entering those talks in a position of relative weakness, this ongoing shift in the Middle East regional balance away from the United States and its allies poses a high-stakes challenge for U.S. foreign policy. For its own interests, and on classic balance of power grounds, the United States needs strategic rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But this would require Washington to give up its long-standing but deeply self-damaging determination to suppress the emergence of independent power centers in the Middle East, and to come to terms with the Islamic Republic as an enduring and legitimate political entity representing legitimate national interests. We argue that the United States also needs rapprochement with the Islamic Republic because the United States, in our view, and again we think increasingly supported by more and more data, is a country in decline at the global level. American standing and influence in world affairs is declining in large measure because of American elites' self-serving claims about the United States as uniquely benevolent, and that these claims are appearing less and less credible for more and more of the international community. For many years, American administrations have linked American primacy to the provision of global public goods. These include the transactional platforms and the political and security arrangements needed to sustain economic openness and encourage continued liberalization. The provision of such public goods has been bound up with the elaboration of rules-based regimes for key dimensions of international security, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and for global commerce. In the post-Cold War period, though, the United States has with increasing frequency acted in ways that violate the very rules for international regimes it helped to create. This is exemplified in America's approach to its disagreements with Iran, with the Islamic Republic, over Iran's nuclear activities. I changed that to the Islamic Republic rather than Iran because we didn't have a disagreement with Iran's nuclear activities under the Shah. The NPT is an important treaty to look at in this regard. It is a set of 3 interrelated commitments by signatories divided into 2 categories, essentially weapon states and non-weapon states. In Articles 2 and 3 of the NPT, non-weapon states, like Iran, have committed not to build or acquire nuclear weapons. In Article 6 of the NPT, weapon states, the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China, have committed to progressive nuclear disarmament. In Articles 4 and 5 of the treaty, all signatories have agreed that there is an inalienable right, quote unquote, inalienable right to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes without discrimination. And those parties are obligated to facilitate the exercise of that right, especially by non-weapon states. Now, there have long been strains between weapon states and non-weapon states over the weapon states' poor compliance, to say the least, over their commitment to disarmament. Today, though, these strains are especially acute over perceived tensions between the NPT's signatories' commitment to nonproliferation and their commitment to enabling the peaceful use of nuclear technology. These tensions reflect a clash between 2 very different approaches to interpreting the NPT and international law and relations. One approach gives the NPT's 3 core bargains equal standing. This approach is grounded in a positivistic model of international law and global governance in which substantive and procedural norms for international behavior are created by the consent of independent sovereign states. The alternative approach to interpreting the NPT holds that non-weapon states' commitment to nonproliferation must trump those by weapon states to nuclear disarmament and by all states to the peaceful use of nuclear technology. This approach is grounded in a more policy-oriented, or essentially results-oriented, model of international law and global governance, whereby what matters are the policy goals and values that motivated the creation of the particular rules and norms, not the rules and norms themselves. The policy-oriented or results-oriented model also ascribes a special role in interpreting those rules and norms to the most powerful states in the international system. Conflict between these 2 approaches to interpreting the NPT
is especially sharp over fuel cycle technology, the ultimate dual-use capability. For those holding that the NPT's three core bargains have equal standing, meaning the non-Western world virtually in its entirety, the right of non-weapon states to safeguarded enrichment is clear from the NPT itself, from its negotiating history, and from subsequent practice, with at least a dozen non-weapon states building fuel cycle infrastructures potentially capable of making nuclear weapons. From a positivistic perspective, the contemporary denial of that right by a handful of Western states amounts to rewriting the NPT unilaterally in order to keep non-Western states in an inferior position. This is the core of Iran's stand. By contrast, those claiming that nonproliferation trumps the NPT's two other core bargains claim there is no treaty-based right to enrichment. From a policy-oriented perspective, the manner in which non-weapon states pursue the peaceful use of nuclear technology must necessarily be subordinated to the NPT's overriding goal of nonproliferation. This position is advocated by the United States, Britain, France, and Israel. That's it. Those four countries. That's it. Strikingly, at one time, Washington held that there was a right to peaceful use, including the indigenous peaceful enrichment, peaceful use, including the indigenous development of safeguarded fuel cycle capabilities. In 1968, as the United States and Soviet Union, the NPT's sponsors, prepared to open it for signature, American officials testified before Congress that the NPT would permit non-weapon states, and in fact did permit it by that point, non-weapon states to pursue the fuel cycle. But since the end of the Cold War, the United States, again with Britain, France, and Israel, has been determined to constrain the diffusion of fuel cycle capabilities to non-Western states. The main motive has been to maximize America's freedom of unilateral military initiative, and in the Middle East to maximize Israel's. As a result, the United States has come to hold that there is no treaty-based right for non-weapon states to pursue fuel cycle capabilities, and that weapon states and their allies with nuclear industries are entitled to decide which non-weapon states can possess fuel cycle technology. Non-Western states see these efforts to constrain the diffusion of fuel cycle capabilities as a far bigger threat than Iran's nuclear activities. Disagreements over this issue are what is effectively blocking efforts to deal with questions about Iran's nuclear program through diplomacy. Again, just four countries, the United States, Britain, France, and Israel, of course, which is not even a signatory to the NPT, have led the charge to deny Iran's right to enrichment. For them, any diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear issue will require Iran to stop its fuel cycle activities, at least on an open-ended and long-term basis, perhaps a decade or more. In contrast, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the 120 non-aligned movement countries who represent 2/3 of the UN and who have elected Iran to be their head, they have all unequivocally recognized Iran and other non-weapon states' right to develop safeguarded indigenous fuel cycle capabilities. All of them have. For non-weapon states and others holding that the NPT's three core bargains have equal standing, the outlines of a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear issue are as clear as Iran's right to enrichment. It's a recognition of Iran's nuclear rights in exchange for greater transparency in its nuclear activities. Working with Turkey, just 3 years ago, Brazil brokered this kind of solution. It is known as the Tehran Declaration, agreed upon in May 2010, where the Islamic Republic of Iran accepted America's terms, written in a letter from President Obama to the presidents of Brazil and Prime Minister of Turkey, to swap most of Iran's then stockpile of enriched uranium for fuel for its research reactor in downtown Tehran. That declaration, though, had a fatal flaw for the United States. It recognized Iran's right to enrich. And for that reason, the Obama administration rejected it in 2010 and moved to impose sanctions through the UN. Now, it's clear from our discussions with a range of Iranian officials and political figures, both in New York during the General Assembly a couple of weeks ago and during our most recent trip last week to Tehran, that recognition of Iran's nuclear rights is and will be indispensable for Iran for a deal. Whether the Obama administration is ready to deal with Iran on this basis is, of course, very important for U.S.-Iranian relations and to resolve this issue. But it's also a powerful test as to whether the United States is really prepared to recognize the ongoing rise of non-Western powers to positions of international influence, and to recognize the corresponding imperative of truly universal, rules-based international order in the 21st century. If the United States is not prepared to recognize these realities and adjust its policies accordingly, it will provoke intensifying backlash from non-Western powers that will damage America's long-term position in international affairs even further. At this point, Flynt is going to pick up to discuss what it would take for the United States to get its Iran policy, in our view, right, and why that is so hard for American political elites.
Thank you. In exploring Washington's antipathy toward the Islamic Republic, we've come to see it as grounded in unattractive but fundamental aspects of American strategic culture. Difficulty accepting independent power centers, as Hillary noted. Hostility to non-liberal states, unless, of course, they subordinate their foreign policies to U.S. preferences, as Egypt did under Sadat and Mubarak, in which case non-liberal states are just fine, and an unreflective but deeply rooted sense that U.S.-backed norms, rules, and transnational decision-making processes are really meant to constrain others, not the United States itself. Because these attitudes are so strong among America's political and policy elites, an American president will have to invest considerable political capital dealing with them in order to achieve U.S.-Iranian rapprochement. To realign U.S.-Iranian relations, an American president will also have to be willing to revise thoroughly and fundamentally American grand strategy in the Middle East. For these features of American strategic culture are very much linked to the imperial turn in U.S. policy toward the Middle East, which conditions the demonization of would-be challengers to American primacy there. The most significant manifestation of this, in our view, has been Washington's persistent refusal to understand and accept the basic model underlying Iran's post-revolutionary order, the integration of participatory politics and elections with principles and institutions of Islamic governance and a strong commitment to foreign policy independence. This refusal has had real consequences for America's Iran debate. Instead of recognizing the dysfunctionality of their country's Iran policy and correcting course, American political policy media elites have preferred, to a large extent still prefer, looking to regime change in Tehran to solve America's Iran problem. To justify this kind of posture, these elites routinely depict the Islamic Republic as an illegitimate system so despised by its own population as to be in imminent danger of overthrow. They've been doing this for more than 30 years, virtually since the Islamic Republic's founding out of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and for more than 30 years the Islamic Republic has consistently defied their relentless predictions of its collapse or defeat. The Islamic Republic has survived because its basic model, again, participatory Islamic governance and foreign policy independence, this model is, according to polls, electoral participation rates, other indicators, it is what a majority of Iranians living inside their country want. They do not want a political order grounded in Western-style secular liberalism. They want an indigenously generated political order reflecting their cultural and religious values. As reformist President Mohammad Khatami wrote shortly before he left office, freedom, independence, and progress within the context of both religiosity and national identity. This was the vision of Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Khomeini, the Islamic Republic's founding father. It's embodied in the Islamic Republic's constitution. It is what the Islamic Republic, with all its flaws, offers Iranians the chance to pursue on their own terms. Even most of those Iranians who want the Islamic Republic to evolve in significant ways still want it to be, at the end of the day, the Islamic Republic of Iran. As Hillary alluded, impressive developmental outcomes since the revolution reinforce Iranian sense of the Islamic Republic as a genuinely national project that is theirs to build and own, warts and all. Under the Islamic Republic, Iran has diversified its economy to a greater extent than any other major oil exporting country in the Middle East. This means, among other things, that Iran today is significantly less dependent on oil revenues for both its government budget and to cover its imports than Saudi Arabia or than any of the smaller Gulf Arab monarchies on the other side of the Persian Gulf. Contrary to deeply rooted but ill-informed Western stereotypes, the Islamic Republic has achieved far more progressive outcomes in alleviating poverty, delivering health care, providing educational access, and, yes, expanding opportunities for women than the Shah's regime ever did. Of course, many Western commentators now tell us that sanctions are finally working to undermine the Islamic Republic's basic stability. On that point, recalling our recent visits to Iran, no one who has walked the streets of Tehran recently, as we have done, seen that Iran's economy is not collapsing, and talked with a range of Iranians living in Iran could possibly think that sanctions, notwithstanding the real hardships that they cause for ordinary Iranians, no one could think that sanctions are working in a way that will compel either the Islamic Republic's implosion or its surrender to American demands that it forsake indigenous nuclear fuel cycle capabilities. There is no constituency among conservatives, reformists, or even what's left of the Green Movement, no constituency prepared to accept such an outcome. Moreover, the Islamic Republic has, over years, demonstrated its capacity to adapt dynamically to sanctions in ways that do not just stave off collapse, but in some instances actually benefit its economy. Notwithstanding the Islamic Republic's staying power, foreign policy pundits who, in many cases, have no direct connection to on-the-ground reality inside Iran continue telling us that the system is on the verge of collapse. This message is reiterated by America's so-called Iran experts, many of whom are Iranian expatriates or Iranian Americans whose families fled the revolution and want to see the Islamic Republic overthrown. A good example of this came in June 2009 when, in a collective act of analysis by wishful thinking, American elites widely anticipated a victory by former Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi over incumbent President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in that year's Iranian presidential election. When, instead, Ahmadinejad won re-election, those same analysts and elites almost universally condemned the outcome as a fraud. They did so even though every methodologically sound poll conducted in Iran before and after the election, including polls conducted by Western polling groups, 14 polls in all, showed that Ahmadinejad's re-election with roughly 2/3 of the vote which is what the official results show that he got, was eminently plausible. And American elites embraced a narrative of election fraud, even though neither Mousavi nor anyone else ever presented any evidence of how the election was stolen. This never demonstrated but fervently espoused narrative also conditioned American elites' romanticization of the Green Movement, widely portrayed in the West as a mass popular uprising poised to sweep away the Islamic Republic, perhaps within just a few months. But it was evident to anyone prepared to look soberly at reality that even at its height, the Green Movement did not represent anything close to a majority of Iranians, and that within a week of the June 2009 election, the movement's social base was already contracting. For making these points, Hillary and I were roundly excoriated by journalists, think tank pundits, and others, basically for believing that Iranians could be reliably polled like other populations. But our focus on objective data was and is right. This focus was powerfully validated by the Islamic Republic's June 2013 presidential election, when the same kind of high-quality polling data that we used in 2009 allowed us 4 years later to predict Hassan Rouhani's narrow victory. We were able to do this when virtually all American commentators and purported Iran experts were declaring such an outcome impossible. Perhaps the most glaring example of this came on June 14, 2013, Iranian election day, as Iranian voters had already begun casting their ballots. In its lead editorial that morning, the Washington Post intoned that Hassan Rouhani, quote, will not be allowed to win, close quote, a statement reflecting American pundits' near consensus position. Such contrived analyses only extended American elites' 34-year failure to understand Iran's 1979 revolution, to take seriously the system this revolution created, and to accept the Islamic Republic as it is. After Rouhani won, some American commentators and foreign policy elites tried to cite his victory as proof, or tried to argue that sanctions were responsible for his victory. We can talk more about this in the Q&A if you like, but let me say for now that Rouhani's victory was not the result of sanctions. There's not a shred of evidence for the claim, but that's nothing new in America's fact-free discourse about Iranian politics. As Hillary noted, the United States must, for its own interests, take a fundamentally different approach to Iran. The United States needs to come to terms with the Islamic Republic, not as a favor to Iran, but to save its own strategic position in the Middle East and globally. Coming to terms with the Islamic Republic means accepting it as a legitimate political order representing legitimate national interests and as a rising regional power unwilling to subordinate its foreign policy to Washington. No American president since the Iranian Revolution, not even Barack Hussein Obama, has been prepared to do this. But it is a key argument in our book that this is not just the only basis on which diplomacy with Iran can succeed, it is the only way for the United States to avert slow strategic catastrophe. There is an important precedent in recent American history for the kind of diplomacy we are talking about. Accepting a rising regional power as a legitimate entity pursuing its interests in a fundamentally rational and defensive way is how President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger enabled the historic opening to China in the early 1970s. Nixon and Kissinger's achievement was not to talk to Beijing. Washington had been doing that for years through ambassadorial level discussions in Geneva and Warsaw. Those talks were narrow, focused on grievance and American demands, and, as Kissinger describes them, served only to institutionalize stalemate. Nixon and Kissinger's achievement was not to talk to Beijing. Their achievement was to accept and to persuade Americans to accept the People's Republic as, in Nixon's words, a nation pursuing its own interests as it perceives these interests just as we follow our own interests as we see them. China and Iran epitomize what Martin Jakes calls civilization states, societies identified as coherent civilizations well before they became nation states in the modern Western sense of the term. Moreover, both countries' current political orders were born of revolutions dedicated to restoring their nation's sovereignty and independence after long periods of domination by foreign, especially Western, powers. In strategic perspective, both the People's Republic of China and the Islamic Republic of Iran, with their revolutionary commitments to foreign policy independence, have posed broadly similar challenges for U.S. foreign policy, and in both cases, the United States did not initially respond well to these challenges. In China's case, the United States worked assiduously for 20 years after the Chinese Revolution to isolate and undermine the People's Republic of China. Washington didn't just pursue a regime change policy toward the People's Republic, it recognized a whole other political structure based on Taiwan as the quote-unquote real government of China. The results were terrible for the United States. Trying not to contain but to suppress and undermine China ended up undermining the U.S. position in Asia and got America into the corrosive quagmire of Vietnam. In this context, Nixon recognized the imperative of rapprochement with Beijing. His initiative to realign relations with China saved America's position in Asia after the draining disaster of Vietnam and restored America's global leadership. If Obama accepted the Islamic Republic in the same way, an equally thorough realignment of U.S.-Iranian relations would be possible, but only on the basis of such acceptance. Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei and the 4 Iranian presidents elected over the course of Khamenei's now 24-year tenure as the Islamic Republic's supreme leader have all said repeatedly that Iran is open to better relations with America, but only on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and American acceptance of the Islamic Republic. Today, engaging Iran on this basis is Obama's single biggest foreign policy challenge. We'll see if he's up to it. Thank you.